Okay, well, happy Wednesday to everybody. We'll go ahead and get started with today's class session. Real briefly here, just to sort of cover where we are and where we're going. We're really pretty much on track with what my expectation was for the topics to be covered, the material to be read and whatnot this week. And so we're going to cover chapter 6. We just barely opened the door to that on Monday, and I'll finish that today. I should be able to adequately get through that in today's class session. I'm just going to, before I do that, I've got to kind of back up a little bit because there's a part of chapter 5 that I had forgotten, and I didn't know that I had forgotten until afterwards. And so I'm just going to real briefly take about 5 minutes and go over that. Next week is going to be solely dedicated, I think, to chapter 7. I indicated before that chapter 5 was a pretty critical chapter, and I think chapter 7 is maybe, if not more so, particularly in the sense that it leads us into the next several chapters dealing with market structures and and how firms operate and what some of these definitional items are and some of the technical items. So chapter 7 is a pretty technical chapter, and I do want to take my time with it. And my plan in devising the course schedule was that we would get to chapter 8 prior to the second exam, which is scheduled for the end of week 8. That's still going to be on track with that. However much I know there's no way we're going to get all the way through chapter 8. It's a fairly large chapter, but I'm saying right now I'm not sure how much at all we'll get to chapter 8. If we do, that's great. I may just sort of make a little note here, maybe chapter 8 in question marks, to maybe start a little bit early and then pick it up then again on the 28th when we come back for week 8. And then we'll have a review session for the first exam, or the second exam, which is Wednesday, beginning Wednesday of that week. So 2 weeks from today, exam 2 is coming up, okay? And by the way, if anybody has any questions about the first exam and want to know how you did, what you missed, in other words, get with me and I can get with you individually on that. You're free to use the questions link under coursework discussions for general questions about, hey, what does this mean? Can you explain it? And particularly those items that you think everyone may benefit from hearing about. But if it's something that it deals with you individually, why did I miss number 14 or whatever, then that's better addressed in email or phone call or my office hours, which are in this class or right before this class on Monday on the 5th floor in Max Salazar. If you're on campus, you want to stop by, feel free to. I'm in office 34. That's I didn't have that when we first started. I don't know that it matters because you can't just walk in. You've got to go through the receptionist to get buzzed in. But that's where I'm going to be if you need to see me individually or any other time that works for you. Okay. All right. So that's the schedule. That's where we are now, and we're pretty much on track with where I think is a good place to be. One thing I wanted to cover, and I didn't realize this frankly until after I had left class on Monday, that I didn't cover. I sort of alluded to it, but I sort of maybe got halfway there, but didn't really close the loop. And that was dealing with what your textbook calls polar cases of elasticity. And that is what we call perfectly elastic and perfectly inelastic demand curves. Now, remember, we've covered 4 different types of elasticity ratios, but the most important by far is the price elasticity of demand. And in fact, I didn't spend very much time at all talking about price elasticity of supply. And in fact, usually I really don't, because the methodology is the same. They don't use the same formulas. All you do is take the letter D out, put the letter S in, that's it. And then the same sorts of relationships. But what I did want to focus on with supply elasticity was this notion of the ability, not the willingness so much, but the ability to supply output as the price changes. And we're seeing the rise in prices of a lot of goods, but firms not really able to supply that output simply because of the ability, not the willingness, but the ability, due to supply constraints. A lot of them having to do with the labor market, a lot of them having to do with international trade and sourcing of items. There's been some concern over the ability to get personal computers at some point in the somewhat near future, because a lot of the components are made elsewhere, and some of those items have to be sourced. And so that's a consideration, something to think about. So this is we're going to talk about 2 different cases of elasticity. Now, price elasticity of demand, that first ratio that we talked about. And we said that one of the things that we did make the case was that flatter demand curves are associated with elastic demand. That is, if the price changes a little bit, the quantity demanded responds more than proportionally, which is why that ratio comes out to be greater than 1. It's a greater than proportional reaction on the quantity side, on the quantity demanded side, to a change in the price, for whatever the reason the price change is, whether it's up or down. Price going up, big response to the quantity going down, quantity demanded going down, price goes down, big response to the quantity demanded going up. But what about cases in which you have a demand curve that looks like this? And we say it's perfectly elastic. And if you've already read the book, then you've already seen this, so this is not new. The book calls these polar cases, and that's indeed what they are. This would be a case of a perfectly elastic demand curve, which basically comes out to be forming a right angle with the horizontal axis. And that is, what's going on here is this: whatever the price is, and we'll just simply say whatever the price is whatever the price is. We'll call that P hat. We'll put a little hat on that. And the quantity demanded is whatever the quantity is based upon supply availability, whatever the demand side wants. The price may change if demand itself rises. In this case, it's not so much a rightward shift given the fact that it's horizontal, but it would be upward or down in this case. But the price can be any number of prices, any of these numbers of different Qs at the same price. But think about this: if the price goes up for whatever reason, the quantity demanded may fall all the way down to 0. And there wouldn't be any reason why the price would be less than the equilibrium price of P hat, because it wouldn't make sense. It wouldn't be logical for a seller who has essentially infinite quantity demanded to lower the price of the good. For what reason? It wouldn't make sense, would it? And so in this particular case, the demand side would demand essentially unlimited quantities at that price, and in fact lower as well. I mean, we talked about this idea of buyers will take any price lower than the given price, but there'd be no incentive to lower the price, because the price is, if they're going to charge this, they might as well charge this, because the demand is essentially infinite. In fact, we say the slope is essentially infinite in this particular case. But if it goes up a little bit, then the quantity demand falls to 0. And so you might be thinking, okay, well, gosh, we talked about a 45-degree down demand curve, then we saw it flatter and steeper. Now we've got one that's perfectly horizontal, and now you're going to throw another one at me that's perfectly vertical. It's like, what is going on here? Well, we're saying these are extreme cases, okay? But not extreme in the sense that it's once in a lifetime, you never see it. We're saying they're extreme cases in the sense that they do exist, but they're not the norm. And we'll see beginning in chapter 8, now this is not really all that uncommon from our conception of what the demand curve looks like for the particular industry that we're going to be talking about, that is perfect competition. And that is, and it's the term is aptly named. I know we haven't gotten to that point yet, but think about an environment which the good will sell at this price at any quantity, but if the price goes up a little bit, or even if it's not something, even if it's this much, right? Even just a smidgen, the quantity demanded falls to 0. Why? Because there's competition involved, and that's what we call perfect competition. And we'll see that's associated with a perfectly flat or elastic demand curve. And we'll talk about what the implications are of that. We'll probably do, it'll extend beyond next Monday's class session, or a week from Monday's class session, no question about it. Because first of all, I've got to lay some groundwork too as to where we're going to be going after the second exam, and that is to sort of discuss what that third segment of the class really is about, okay? So that's a case of perfect elasticity. What about perfectly inelastic? Well, we're saying the price can be whatever the price is, all these different prices, and the quantity demanded is not going to change. We'll just call that Q hat. And this would be a case of perfectly inelastic, and that is the idea that whatever the price is, the quantity demanded isn't going to change for whatever reason. And if you think about what this means here, well, we said before that steeper demand curves imply inelasticity when it comes to the price elasticity of demand. Well, perfectly, that is completely vertical, that forms a right angle with the horizontal axis, implies what? It implies perfect inelasticity. Think about this then from the standpoint of who has power in the transaction. This is important. This is going to be a major theme as we get going throughout, particularly after the second exam. In this case, in perfect elasticity, where does the power lie? It lies with the demand side. The demand side could say, you know what? No, we're not going to pay 10 cents more per unit for this particular good. We'll buy 0 from you. Because why? Because I can buy from somebody else. I don't care, because it's all about price when it comes to this good. Now you've got to think that this is not some good that has lots of desirability and brand recognition. This would not be something like Nike tennis shoes or Cartier watches or something like that, very heavily branded goods. We're talking about things which are easily replaceable. Something like a lumber at a lumber yard. Do you really care if it has even a brand name on it? Do you care where it came from? If it's Georgia wood or Oregon wood, do you really care? You probably don't. You probably don't. So as a result of this, price, all about price. Here, it's all about price, but the power goes to the supply side, which can charge any price it wants, and the quantity demand isn't going to change. Buyers will pay whatever price. And so as you can imagine, there's every incentive to keep the price elevated. And so what kind of goods are we talking about here? Well, we're talking about goods for which there are no substitutes, or it's an extremely heavily branded good, which even then probably wouldn't be perfectly inelastic. But we're talking about a good primarily that people will pay whatever price it is because they've got to have it, and there's no other real way around it. And in this case, one of the examples, and I don't know if your textbook used this particular example, but something like a life-saving drug has often been associated with perfect inelasticity. If you don't take the drug, you will not survive. Well, that would make you very perfectly inelastic. This is also very controversial because then we get into charges of price gouging, profiteering, etc. on the case of the supply side, particularly with drugs. And if you follow the news at all, particularly when it comes to drug pricing, there's been no shortage of complaints about drug pricing and about the fact that people have to be able to have certain drugs in order to survive or at least be somewhat healthy. And we've heard of cases in which these drug prices are so elevated that people end up taking half doses, splitting pills in half, skipping doses, which I think doctors universally would argue is not a good thing, but it is what it is from a budget standpoint. So, and that's really going to lead us into what we're talking about with regard to chapter 6. So these are polar cases, perfectly elastic, perfectly inelastic. And this is not the last time that we will talk about these. We'll return to these again and again, particularly the former case of perfect elasticity. That will be a recurring theme as we get going. So let me see if I can refocus the camera here back on where we are here and on the middle screen. Okay, hopefully that's visible. I apologize for the fact that we've got this sort of weird camera angle. I don't know why it's oriented that way. Maybe it's because of the fact that we're not getting like a straight on head-on view. A head-on view would put us somewhere like right around here, which in fact it would put us right here, and that would do us no real good at all. So it'd be nice if we had a camera that could move, but this isn't Hollywood where we do what we can. Okay, the technology is better than what it used to be. I will say that. Okay, so any questions about that bit that I just want to sort of clean up and pick up from chapter 5? I know chapter 5 is coming to an end. It seems like we've been talking about it a while, but it is an important chapter, and I did omit it. It took really to my horror after class ended that I didn't get to it. So anyway, let's move on to chapter 6, and I want to sort of do a little bit of backing up in order to go forward, which is not uncommon. And it's something I've talked about on Monday, and it's something I'm going to talk about as we go forward because it really is important. There is a reason why we talk about the circular flow model, and we talk about the various economic actors and what they're up to. And that is that we talked about this idea of maximizing behavior. And that is, we're going to make the case that economic actors are engaged in what's called maximizing behavior and maximizing behavior of the actors. And I know I gave this to you on Monday, but it's, if you haven't seen that video yet, or maybe missed it or erased it, or well, you can't erase it, but if you didn't get it, I'll go over it again. We have 3 actor groups, and I think this was one of the last things I talked about. We have households, and we have firms, and we have government. And we're going to talk about households today. We talked a little bit about it with regard to elasticity. That was just sort of a technical issue that will be useful to us as we go forward. We're going to talk about, beginning in week 8, we're going to talk about firms for about, I guess maybe at least a 2-week period. And then we'll talk about government in its various roles. When we talk about maximizing behavior, what are households seeking to maximize? They're seeking to maximize utility. We're seeking to maximize utility. Now, when I talk about utility, well, let me come back to that utility, because I want to talk about this maximized behavior and that what are they trying to maximize? They're trying to maximize benefit. They're trying to maximize benefit. So in the case of utility, when we talk about households maximizing utility, what we're saying is that they're trying to maximize the benefit that they get from economic life on the consumption side. We will get into this idea as households as demanders of goods, that is, as consumers. We will return to the idea of households in the other part of their role, right? Actors play roles in the circular flow model as providers of labor, and we'll ask ourselves, is their behavior that of maximizing wages? And I think that's a much more difficult proposition to say that households' primary maximizing behavior is that of maximizing wages. I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that that is not the case. That, and if you don't like the term wages, maybe it's maximizing wealth, income, whatever. I don't think that's necessarily the way households behave. If it were, everybody would have a second job or a third job, or if it were about wealth, then nobody would buy a luxury good or take a vacation or anything like that. I don't think that's the case, but what all consumers do, even whether they understand it or not, they even on an emotional level, if not a logical level, is they seek to maximize their benefit from consumption. The benefit as it relates to households, we simply call utility. And I don't mean utility here in the sense of like P&M or New Mexico Gas. I mean utility as a term, meaning the benefit occurring to households from consuming goods. What was the definition that I gave in the PowerPoint presentation? It was the satisfaction of benefit that buyers derive from consumption. The satisfaction of benefit that buyers derive from consumption. If we didn't get a benefit from consumption, nobody would consume anything, right? Obviously we do. It goes without saying, doesn't really need that much explanation, except for the fact that we will get into some of the details of how we make choices. And really the title of this chapter is Consumer Choice, because there is really an entire sort of area of focus within microeconomics called consumer choice theory. And there are some theoretical aspects of it. So the maximized behavior of households is to maximize utility. When it comes to business firms, it's to maximize profit. So maximize profit. We're going to make this case again and again. And I know that sometimes doesn't sit well with everyone who would like for businesses to be more socially minded, that they are trying to make a product that benefits mankind, humankind, that is good for the environment, is socially beneficial, that it isn't something that is detrimental. It's not a dangerous product, for instance. Yes, well, I think all of those are issues, but they are issues that don't really affect the firm themselves, other than the fact that they are sort of forced onto the firms. Because at the end of the day, it's about maximizing profit. And for those who run companies, if they're not at least being perceived by the owners of the companies as trying to maximize profit, then they won't have a very long tenure at the top of that organization, typically. And that's my experience. And I will say this, having said all this, and I know that there was an economist, I think I may have mentioned this earlier a few weeks ago, about the economist Milton Friedman, who said back in the 60s or 70s that 1960s, 1970s, that the only goal of firms is to maximize profit so they can maximize the returns to shareholders. And I know a lot of people didn't like that idea, but he did have the ability to be controversial in his own way for other reasons. And I think that today, most economists would say, would agree with that, essentially, but that society really demands more of businesses, and being more socially minded, I think, is sort of focused on it. But at the end of the day, it does come down to profit, no question about it. And I think I mentioned also on Monday that if you took a finance course, and I've taught finance in the past, I think you would probably have in that sort of discipline, you would probably have a dual objective: maximizing profit, but that would be considered a short run thing, and maximizing the value of the firm, which is more of a long run proposition. That value of the firm, like raising shareholders' equity and the stock price, that's not really our concern here in an econ course. It would definitely be in a finance course. That doesn't necessarily have to conflict with this at all, because we're just going to focus on this short run piece of profit. Okay. And then finally, governments are seeking to maximize social welfare. And what did I say last time about this idea of social welfare? We said that we should sort of get in our minds right now that welfare does not necessarily imply welfare programs, very specific programs, because I know people hear the term welfare and they immediately think of welfare programs. And one thing I didn't really realize so much, but a couple semesters back when I had a discussion question in my fully online class about unemployment, a lot of people were hearing the word unemployment, they were immediately thinking of unemployment benefits, unemployment programs. And I didn't even think, because we talked about so-and-so is getting unemployment. And we know what that means. So-and-so is laid off and they're getting unemployment checks on a weekly basis, right? And so I think that it's easy to understand, but I wasn't thinking of it in those terms. And I kept wondering why people were talking about unemployment checks and benefits and unemployment running out and all that. And I thought, well, unemployment running out, what is, and I thought, oh, and it took me a little bit of time to sort of come to that. And so when we think of these things, think of unemployment as being the thing, unemployment, which is really more of a macro topic anyway, but welfare as not being program specific like unemployment benefits or whatever, which are a form of welfare, frankly, but rather welfare as defined from the original meaning, which goes back 200 or 300 years, and that is the benefit to humanity from economic activity, and that government seeks to sort of sand away the rough edges of free market systems in order to make them work for people's for the most benefit. And if you go back to the writings a long time ago of John Stuart Mill, and you talked about utilitarianism, which, by the way, is the word utility has been around for a while as well, which has to do with society in general, getting the most benefit for the most people. That's really what that means, even though that may be hard to measure. It is still an element of public policy in most industrial economies. And that is the idea that not everyone is successful at playing the game of capitalism. It is a reality. And by the way, some people really don't want to play the game all that much. I think probably maybe you even, or somebody that you know really isn't really interested in going to work or making a lot of money or making any money or doing much of anything or creating a product and whatnot. We are all kind of different, aren't we? And so there's a great diversity within society, but nonetheless, we all are impacted by economics. Whether you choose to not really be an active participant in the economy, and even if you are like on these TV shows, people living off the grid, they still are part of an economic system. It is just part of nature that we all are part of an economic system. So what government's role is to try to smooth out these edges, particularly for those who are not benefiting. And this would particularly include those who simply cannot, succeed in ways that however we define success, whether it's income, wealth, a healthy standard of living or whatever, because of any of the reasons, health reasons, age reasons, infirmity, whatever. There are those folks who are always going to be lagging. I mean, these go back to biblical times. There's always talk about they're always going to be poor, and the government hasn't always been concerned with the poor, quite frankly. And even as of my grandparents' time, if you were out of work, you were out of work, and you were on your own, right? And so you get the idea that that's one of the maximizing behaviors. So we're going to talk about utility. And what was the definition? To measure the satisfaction or the benefit that society gains from consumption, that households gain from consumption, that is ordinary buyers. And we're going to right now ignore the role of firms in their buying, because it's going to be a function of maximizing profit. And we'll talk much more about the cost of firms of buying output for use as inputs into its production process, things like materials and capital goods, things of that nature. But by the way, one thing, and I'll return to this again, and that's the idea of benefit. All these can be considered benefit. How do households benefit? Maximizing utility. How do firms benefit? Maximizing profit. How does government benefit? By maximizing social welfare. All those are considered benefit. And by the way, if you are, and I know that a lot of times students who want to get sort of a different perspective on a particular topic, I think it's great. I love the internet for this reason, among others, but it's a good one. And it's the idea you can, if something doesn't really make sense to you, you can sort of Google it and maybe get 7 or 8 different descriptions that might just sort of lock into your own thinking and experience a bit better. And you might see this called marginal benefit. It's the same thing, only marginal benefit is sort of more broadly construed as being that would accrue to any actor. But utility is one that we're simply going to say is unique to the household actor group in their role as consumers, and we will return to them as their role as producers, that is, producers of labor. Okay. All right. So when we talk about, talking about measuring benefit or satisfaction, we're talking about measuring in utility in utils. Utils is simply a hypothetical unit of value. And I know that over the years, students have sort of, not liked the idea very much of hypothetical units of value. And I'm trying to explain that there are all kinds of hypothetical units of value that are out there. And we'll see these all the time. Even something like, just as an example, it may be a bit ridiculous. When I used to work at a company that was in a downtown area, this was back in Indianapolis, that we used to get little credits for parking. We had so many credits that we could use up, and it was really funny money. We could trade those credits with others if we were going to be on vacation, or I don't think we sold them, but I mean, I guess we could have if we wanted to. But it was really sort of funny money, but it was sort of a hypothetical unit of value. Everyone knew it had some kind of value. Nobody was really clear on what amount of value it was, but everybody wanted to get their hands on them. If somebody wasn't using them, they would try to get a hold of them just so that they could they were parking passes in a garage, so they didn't have to walk in the cold several blocks to get to work. That would be an example. It was funny money that was being passed around. And it's what we would call a soft dollar credit. And in other words, it wasn't real money at all. It was just sort of a hypothetical unit of value, but it had value. And so when we talk about utils, we're saying that I can't tell you what a util is, but I can tell you that it has value, because it's simply the way that we measure utility relative of one good relative to the other. And I think most of us would agree that, let's say, a vacation to Paris would give you more utility or satisfaction probably than going to a state park for the day. Now, I know we're all different. Some would say, I'm not going to go to Paris. That would give me negative utility. Well, maybe that's you, right? Maybe that's you. And maybe some people like parks better than going to Paris. I think most people would prefer to go to Paris, and I don't think I'm too far out on a limb, because there's a reason why people do pay money to go to Paris and pay a lot of money to go to Paris or Rome or wherever. And that's, in fact, utility is the way that we form demand in the first place. So utils are a hypothetical unit of value. And by the way, one of the things that that we're seeing, if you follow any kind of economic news or business news, you can't miss any discussion about cryptocurrency. Bitcoin, Ethereum, Litecoin, I guess there's some, last I heard there was something like 15,000 different cryptocurrencies in circulation out there. I am personally very skeptical about cryptocurrency, but I think it is, at least for now, here to stay, mostly because I think it sort of came along quickly, and governments, like is often the case, didn't know what they were dealing with, and now crypto is out there. I feel pretty strongly it's going to end badly whenever some of this does end. I can't imagine 15,000 alternative currencies which are backed by nothing whatsoever are out there. And then you can say, well, what about US dollars? What, are they backed by something? And in fact, they're not. They're not backed by gold anymore. They used to be at one time, and silver. They used to be at one time. They're backed up by nothing, except for the fact that they've got a very strong government backing them. And so as a result, and it's a managed currency. And right now we're seeing our Federal Reserve wanting to sort of take money out of play because we've got inflation going on. And I know it sounds like I'm sort of dipping my toe into the waters of macroeconomics. I'm simply saying there are all kinds of hypothetical units of value, money even being one of them. But money is a little bit less hypothetical than is cryptocurrency. But anyway, let's talk about this idea of how we measure utility or satisfaction. So first of all, what's the title of this chapter? Consumer choice. When we talk about consumer choice theory, we're talking about this idea that consumers make choices. They make choices based upon a defined set of a defined income. And I know that I've said this before, that I think probably most of us, if you're like me at least, you probably have elderly relatives or friends or acquaintances or neighbors who will say incessantly, I might add, that I'm on a fixed income. And that is true. And I think what they really mean is I'm on a fixed income with no opportunity to change that income. I think that's really probably the second half of that sentence that would make the most sense. Because why? Because the first half of that sentence applies to pretty much everybody. Most people are on a relatively fixed income. Not all, certainly. Salespeople, people who work for tips, people who are engaged in almost everywhere in the entertainment field. The money is up and down, their income is up and down, depending upon a lot of different factors. But if you're a wage earner, a salary earner, you're probably on something like a fixed income. So we start with that proposition that most buyers are on a relatively fixed income. And by the way, even if you're not on a fixed income, even if you're a commissioned salesperson, one of the things that I learned that I thought was a very useful bit of advice was to live below your means and set a budget for spending. And I happened to work in banking in an occupation with a lot of people. A lot of our compensation was variable. And I was a bit concerned when I first entered, changed jobs, where most of my pay was variable. It wasn't fixed in terms of salary, it was more performance-based. And a lady who worked for me at the time gave me some really good advice. And she said, just determine what it is you minimally need to spend, and spend that. And if you have more than that, you can spend it on whatever else. And she wasn't necessarily saying live below your means, but she's saying determine a base. And then in good times, save money. In bad times, you can draw down against that money. So even still, that would imply an element of fixed expenditure based upon a fixed budget. And in fact, when we talk about allocating that income, which we'll say in this particular example is $100. I know your textbook, I think, used something different. I forget exactly what it was, but this is my own concoction here. We've got a monthly budget of $100, which I know is hypothetically low, but it's the example that we're talking about. And we're saying there are two goods available to be purchased: pizza for $10 a piece and concerts at $20 a piece. Okay, and I think your text used soda and movies, I think. Well, you know, it doesn't matter. And nor does it matter what the ratio of one price to the other is. It's simply the idea that you've got choices that you can make given a relatively fixed income. And I want to address something that I first talked about back when we talked about the production possibilities model, and that was, we're giving you two goods to purchase, whereas in the production possibilities model, we were giving you two goods to produce: good A, good B, goods and butter, whatever. And you might think, well, that's in either case, they're both hypothetical, because what economy would produce only two goods, and what household would only be faced with two goods? And I understand that, but it's not an invalid argument. I get that. And if in fact we wanted to take all the goods that a random household would choose, we could just create more graphs, more graphs, more graphs. We could graph it out that way, to the point where we would probably have to use computers, and economists do, when trying to arrange and account for the budgeting of a household for a particular, what we call consumption bundle. And we'll come back to that term consumption bundle a bit later. So in this case, we've got a monthly budget of $100 and goods available, pizza and concerts. So you can spend all your money on concerts, $20 a piece, and in so doing, you consume zero pizza. You can spend it all on pizza, buy 10 pizzas a month, and zero concerts. Or you can allocate it in some other fashion, and you can choose some different combinations. So we'll call these combinations A, B, C, D, E, and F. Okay. And that is the idea that we're allocating them to different amounts of consumption. The same amount of income to different amounts of consumption. And so when we talked about this idea of the production possibilities function, here we can call this a production possibilities function. But what's different here? Well, we've got the same axis, we've got two different goods. That's the same, but here we've got a linear function. And that's because we're assuming a fixed amount here. And the trade-off is exactly proportional throughout. That is, if I trade off one concert, if I'm buying one concert, I'm giving up two pizzas, two concerts, four pizzas. It's the same ratio every time. It's the same fixed increment. So a fixed increment implies what? The same rate of change as one thing goes to another thing. That must be a linear slope, a straight line. So in other words, that's what's different here. That's why we have a fixed amount, because we're given a fixed amount of income, and we're saying that the price doesn't change. That's what makes it different than the curvy production possibilities, where we've got things that are not necessarily even modeled in that, like opportunity costs and whatnot. Here we're just saying that we're avoiding, we're not even including taxes or anything, or any withholding for Social Security, anything like that. We're simply saying this household has got $100 to do what with. That $100 then is what's known as a budget constraint. It's called a budget constraint, sometimes called a budget line, right? So sometimes we'll just simply call it a budget line. The budget line is a budget constraint, meaning what? Meaning you're constrained by the budget that you're given. So when people say, I'm on a fixed income, what they really mean is I've only got a certain amount to spend on a weekly, monthly, whatever basis, and I can spend it however I like, and these are the choices. And by the way, I am not unmindful of the fact that two goods is maybe a bit limiting, and so I'm going to sort of expand this discussion before we end, okay? All right, so if this is a consumption possibilities model, then let's do something called a consumption possibilities table, right? And let's just sort of lay out these possibilities here for us. And so we have two goods, right? We have pizza is one good, concerts are the other good. And we know that we've got a quantity here that we're dealing with. And we've got dollar figures. Oops, let me kind of move this over here a little bit. We've got quantity, and we've got a dollar figure. We've got quantity and a dollar figure there, right? And what are the possibilities here? So the possibilities are A, B, C, D, E, and F. Okay, well, let's start with possibility A, which says 5 concerts, right? And if it's 5 concerts, it must mean 0 pizzas. So if concerts go for $20 a piece and we're consuming no pizzas, well, it must mean we're spending all of our budget on concerts, and we are. So 0 pizzas, and so nothing spent on pizzas and $100 spent on concerts. The opposite would be the case where we're spending all of our money on pizza, and so we're consuming 10 pizzas. At $10 a piece is $100, and having no ability to buy any concerts as a result. So we go to 0 there. And so those are the intercepts on either axis for our ability and willingness to demand just one good and not the other. Where most households would lie would be somewhere in between. And so these points here represent the pizza 2, 4, 6, and 8, right? And we can simply do the math here. The math is easy. It's 10. I mean, I chose these numbers to be easy. Times $2 or times $10 is 20, 40, 60, 80. And even prior to doing the math, we know that we're going to have, we know that to spend every dollar that we've got, we're going to make the assumption every dollar earned is spent. And whether or not that's good budgeting, I don't know. There's no allowance for savings here. By the way, that's not terribly unusual. A lot of households spend pretty much all that they make. And I was having a conversation with a relative the other day who said that she once earned something like $11 per hour, $9 per hour, and now makes about $30 per hour, and she still spends everything that she earns. And so, you know, you get the idea that is a very common form of behavior. Okay, so whether you like it or not, and I'm not trying to pass judgment, and nor did I pass judgment. I'm simply saying that is not uncommon. So 20 plus 80 is always going to be 100. So it's 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, and those are all the different points of possibility that lie upon that budget line. So this is how a household would allocate income to consumption. And again, I want to come back to this idea that if in fact a household wanted to include other goods besides pizza and concerts, we can do it. We can simply create more graphs, and we can simply allocate those differently. And we can do it for every good in what is called the consumption bundle. And I know I talked about this a little bit later in the slide presentation, but a consumption bundle simply is this: that it's the range of possibilities that a household could choose and routinely does choose in its consumption possibilities. And because of the fact that every house, and by the way, whatever the unit of buyer is, whether it's a household or whether it's an individual, we tend to focus on households because, you know, household consumption behavior tends to be done in aggregate, that is for the entire household. But you can do it as an individual as well. I mean, and obviously if an individual is a household, there would be no conflict, but we tend to focus on it as a household. But one thing about households is they tend to have a relatively fixed amount of goods in their consumption bundle. They tend to buy the same things. And I sort of have recognized this for a very long time. When I was a little kid and got dragged along to the store with my mom, I had no choice in the matter. It would not be lost on me that you buy the same kinds of goods pretty much every time, the same kind of detergent, the same kind of trash bag, whatever. You get the idea. In the same quantity, and maybe she didn't like the price. And maybe if the price wasn't to her liking, she would buy a smaller size, right? And we'll get to that here before we end this discussion. So these are not that hypothetical, not as much as you might say, as you might see. And by the way, this is one reason this behavior, this sort of automatic kind of behavior is not lost on sellers, which is one reason why they're always trying to introduce new goods and trying to offer people a 2-for-1 and coupons and discounts and try this, or to the point where they, I don't know if they still do this, but used to send free samples in the mail to people of something like dishwashing liquid or shampoo or something like that in little small packages. I mean, they wouldn't send you a case, but just to get you to try it so that they could get you to adjust your consumption bundle, because the fact is that consumers do tend to react, and the way that they tend to react, which is also not lost on by a long shot on sellers is by branding. If you get people hooked on a particular brand, they will buy that particular brand over and over and over again. And what's more is that sort of behavior tends to be inherited behavior. That my sister will buy the same detergent and the same dishwashing liquid that my mom always bought. I noticed this when I was at her house recently. It was the same everything, and it's because she got dragged along the story more than I did when we were kids, and so she will buy the same peanut butter and paper towels and all that. So we are creatures of that, and branding is one way that sellers can get us sort of fixed onto that, and it's good for them. It may even be good for us, even despite the fact that brand names tend to have a higher price. And we will talk much more about brand names when we get into the next segment of the course after the second exam. Okay. All right. One final thing about budget lines and budget constraints. Oh, by the way, I know your book gets into this, and I think it probably gets a little bit more. Your online text gets a little bit more in detail, maybe the higher weeds about budget constraints. And in fact, I think they may have introduced the term indifference curves. I can't remember because I was looking at my notes, and in some cases I do talk about indifference curves. There won't be anything on an exam about anything called indifference curves. If your text talked about it, if it didn't, just forget I mentioned it. To the extent that we would involve ourselves in that, it would be a 300 level micro course that I tended to view it. Other instructors may differ, okay? One final thing though about budget lines is this, that we're not necessarily locked into this particular budget line of $100 per month, right? If in fact we're able to expand our budget line by pushing the budget line outward, right? So that we had, this budget line that we started with, that we'll now just simply label as BL1, can now shift to become BL2 or BL3. And that is the idea that it could expand. And how would it expand? Through greater income. Over time, we oftentimes do experience greater incomes, which then does allow us to expand our consumption possibilities. And we know that that's the case. In fact, this has got macro implications as well, because whenever the economy is doing well, quantities of demand of goods goes up. There's a bit of discussion early on in your chapter 6, about during the last recession of 2008, 2009, it was observed that not only were people dining more at home and going out to dinner, so in other words, choosing the inferior substitute to the more luxury substitute, but we're also consuming less food in general because their consumption possibilities hadn't gone this direction, they had gone this direction because of reduced incomes. So the consumption possibilities expand. So this is not earth-shattering information that you didn't know coming into this, but that is this. Basically, rising incomes expand consumption possibilities, right? So here we're getting a little bit wonkier with the definition, but rising incomes expand consumption possibilities. So, and not only are we able now to buy both of more concerts and pizzas, is maybe we can now expand it to include other goods in our hypothetical consumption bundle. And by the way, there was a reason why we talked about normal goods and inferior goods. And we said that all luxury goods are normal goods, because, and in fact, luxury goods are one of those goods where it does seem like there's a tipping point where you get to a certain income, and now you're able to afford the luxury car. Now you're able to afford the trip to Australia or whatever. Definitely luxury goods, definitely normal goods in the fact that they respond to income either up or down. But rising incomes expand consumption possibilities. Nothing that's too earth-shattering there. And the converse to that is that falling incomes restrict consumption possibilities. And so the discussion early on in the text was about the recession of 2008, 2009, in which unemployment rose, at one point about 10% of the labor force was out of work. It began to fall not too long after the government intervened in order to improve social welfare. But nonetheless, there were a lot of people out of work. And so as a result, we saw lots more demand for inferior goods and shrinking consumption possibilities. Okay, and one of the areas that took the biggest hit was housing. But housing was responsible for the whole thing in the first place, because as a normal good, when the economy was going great guns, we got more and more houses being built and bigger houses. And so during the 90s is really when this whole term supersized came about. It's because incomes were higher, and so everything else was getting bigger. The vehicles were certainly getting bigger. SUVs are gigantic compared to what they used to be, and trucks and houses and food in restaurants and all that. Bigger as a function of rising income and the ability, the greater enhanced possibility to afford them. And as the economy took a downturn, they went the other direction. And by the way, if gasoline stays elevated in terms of price for any length of time, and I don't know that it will, I'm not confident that it will, but I suspect you'll see smaller vehicles come out as opposed to the very large vehicles that we've got now. But that's if they stay elevated. If they don't stay elevated, I suspect we'll continue to have these large vehicles that are not very fuel efficient. Okay, so questions for me about anything that we talked about with regard to the budget line, consumption possibilities, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so let's pick it up from here. Well, the topic is utility, and it seems like we're not quite getting there, but we are. We really are getting there. So let's talk about this. If we said that consumers are out to maximize their utility and consumption, then what about utility and consumption that we should know about? Well, they're out to maximize it, but before we even get to there, let's talk about something that is something that I'll come back a bit later, and I'll bring up again, and that is the types of values in economics. And I think it's important that we talk about these now, and that we're talking more about definite concrete values, not abstract units of value like utils necessarily. Okay, but I want to focus on this because sometimes it's important for us to sort of talk about what it is we're talking about. Just like in the elasticity piece, I said, look, let's talk about what elasticity is, but before we do that, maybe we should talk about what it is not. We said it's not a dollar figure, it's not a percentage, it's not units, it is a ratio. That's what it is. Well, we've got really three types of values in economics, okay? In microeconomics in particular. So what are the values in economics? This is not in your book, and it's, although it may be sort of inadvertent, we have really three kinds of values in economics. Totals, which are very easy to understand, averages, which are also pretty easy to understand, and marginals, which are a little bit more complicated. We'll spend more time talking about those. Totals are fairly simple to understand. It's just simply the aggregate or the collection of whatever, right? Totals are basically aggregates. All we're doing is simply adding things up. I'm about out of ink here in this. So totals are aggregates. All they are is simply adding up. If we have 200 workers, we've gotten that number by simply adding them up, and that's all we have gotten up there. Averages are what we call mean values. Mean values. I'm going to get rid of this marker here. There are mean values. When we say mean values, it's really a statistical, mathematical, and statistical term, and they're really different kinds of mean values. The most, like there is a geometric mean that gives certain weights to certain values, but that is a bit more abstract, and what we're not going to be getting into yet for a while. But we're talking about what's called that's called the geometric mean. This is called the arithmetic mean that we'll be dealing with, and that's a simple average. If we have 200 workers, we add up all of their ages and divide it by 200. We have the average. What average age of the worker? Pretty straightforward. We get that. If we want the average of, take any two people, we want the average age. We add up both of their ages, divided by 2. Right? That's pretty easy to arrive at. Or if we have the 200 workers, we want the average wage that we pay the worker, and we add up total wages divided by the number of workers, we get an average wage. Now, that may or may not mean anything. That's part of the problem with averages, is it may or may not mean anything at all. What is the average value? And I talk about this a bit later as we get into the discussion about cost, but it's important that we know that averages are a bit misleading, because if you think of some of the averages you've heard before, where the average American household has 1.8 children, right? Well, there's no 8/10 of a child, right? But we know that's an average figure. Well, that's also not really meaningful. It doesn't really help us very much to think about 8/10 of a child, or whatever that percentage is. So you get the idea that it's not always that helpful. Or another example would be if you are a trustee of a church and you have, say, 200 members, and you would like them to pay a certain percentage of their incomes. And because some churches do anticipate that. And then you have a new congregant, and his name is Jeff Bezos, right? The wealthiest person in the world, who now joins. Well, do you assess them? Do you expect him to pay the same? I mean, wouldn't the average, wouldn't 10% of his income just be a gigantic figure that nobody would be able to know what to do? You get the idea. The outlying values really throw averages off tremendously, right? They throw values off. But what is more important in microeconomics is marginals. And marginals are really what we're interested in. That's incrementals. And this is really where we sort of live. We live from one incremental thing to another, one day to the next day, 1 year to the next year, one paycheck to the next paycheck, pay one bill to the next bill. It's incremental. We go from one stage to another in our economic lives and elsewhere in our lives. And that is, we simply go from some old experience to some new experience. And the change in those two experiences is what we would call a marginal. It is some marginal change. And I know that when sometimes people hear the word marginals, they sometimes think of it as being a minimum value or maybe an insignificant value. And that might be okay as a description. Like somebody would say a basketball player's performance was marginal. He scored 3 points last night. Okay, well, that might be one way of viewing it, but we would say, nonetheless, whether he scored 3 points or 40 points in the game, we would still say that was his marginal performance. That was his incremental performance last night, Tuesday night, from his performance, whatever night it was that he played before that, right? And so that's the way that we sort of measure things in economics, is from one level to the next. We simply refer to those as incrementals, okay? And we will be using the term marginal again and again and again, and in various contexts. But here we're sort of introducing the term just because we're going to be using it in the context of utility, okay? And we'll be talking a bit about utility and what it's all about. So when we talked about utility, we're talking about a couple of different values here. Number one is total utility, right? And that is if I am consuming, say, 6 pizzas and 2 concerts, and I'm getting a certain amount of utility. And if I'm consuming 2 pizzas and 4 concerts, then I'm also getting a certain amount of utility that I can add up based upon the total number of utils, this hypothetical unit of value that we get. And by the way, they may differ for others. They may differ, right? Even if it is this abstract notion of utils that are difficult to arrive at, right? We're all different. Some may get value from some may not get value. Even the non-abstract values, some people get utility from some things and some don't. Non-smokers get 0 utility from cigarettes, right? It can, regardless of price, regardless of income, doesn't make any difference. If you don't smoke, you get 0 utility from cigarettes because you don't consume them. If you do smoke, then it's probably different, right? And by the way, you can actually get negative utility from goods as well. And I'll get to that here in just a second. So total utility would be essentially defined as aggregate utils. Aggregate simply meaning add them all up, right? So aggregate utils, right? Well, we're not really interested here in average utility, so we're going to forget about the average part of this for a bit here. But we are interested in the marginal utility. And so marginal utility, we're simply going to refer to as MU, and total utility, we're simply going to refer to as TU. Pretty straightforward as to where that comes from, and that is the incremental utility. Okay, so I really am not doing anything too fancy here other than simply borrowing some of the above to apply it to this particular concept of utility, okay? But I want to continue on with our particular example here of pizza and concerts in order to describe what is going on here with that, okay? So when we talk about marginal utility, how do we add it? Well, first of all, with total utility, we're simply doing this. We're simply adding up all utils, right? Now this sigma is simply what's known as the summation notation, where we're adding them all up. We're starting from 0 to n number of units, right? Whatever n is. N is 10 or n is 5, the maximum for both of those. We're simply adding them up. That's all we're doing. Okay? That's what, so individual from 0 to n units. That's all that's going on there. Well, marginal utility is this. It's defined as the change in total utility, right? Divided by the change in quantity, and that's the quantity consumed in this case. And it's important for us to differentiate quantity consumed from quantity produced. And in this case, it would be quantity demanded. It would be the most logical. Even if there is a shortage, the quantity consumed would still be the quantity demanded, okay? But not the case in the surplus. Okay, so let's talk about what's going on here. And when we talk about these particular kinds of things here, we need to understand that utility is what's called a diminishing function, and it's going to be the first of what's called a diminishing function. And that is, as we go from one incremental level to the next incremental level, we experience a downturn. So here's what goes on with utility. I'm just going to do a quick and dirty graph here. We're going to talk about the quantity consumed of whatever the given question. Let's say it's concerts, so we'll call it Q sub C. Utils represented by U. Same notation over here, where it's quantity consumed over utils. Over here, what we're saying is this, that we are consuming from 0 to whatever, and the more we consume, the more utility we get. But then it starts to sort of tail off. And so the total utility function looks something like that. That is, we don't get equal amounts of benefit or utility over time. The more we consume of something, it begins to tail off. Meaning the change in total utilities, which is the total change in utils, or the change in quantity consumed, must be downward sloping. And so as a result, marginal utility is a downward sloping curve, meaning that there is diminishing marginal utility. Diminishing marginal utility. Let's talk a bit about this and what this means. And I'll give you an example here that will sort of help to illuminate this just a bit more. This idea of diminishing anything is something that we've heard before, I think. A lot of you probably heard the term diminishing returns before, right? That is, you do so much of something that your benefit is no longer good. In fact, your returns are diminishing. Examples that have been used forever in college textbooks are studying for exams, where the first hour you get lots and lots of benefit. The second hour, it's still beneficial, but it's not as much. You're covering some of the same old ground. You're getting tired. You're not picking up as much new information, to the point where after the 10th hour of studying for the same exam, you're not picking up anything more. You've gotten all that you need to get out of it. You're ready for the exam. Okay, that sort of thing. Okay, that's one that I think is you know that professors have write these textbooks, and so maybe that's not the one that would be most agreeable to people, but any kind of a good. And one of the things, as long as I was a student before becoming a faculty member, was that it seems like professors would always use examples of glasses of beer. And that is, your first beer gives you lots of satisfaction. Second beer, less satisfaction. Third, less and less, incrementally, to the point where it could actually be negative utility. You could drop below 0 here. If you have, I don't know, whatever the number is of beers, that could be actually negative utility. You could be getting sick or whatever, or pass out, or whatever negative outcome you would define as being negative utility. So but it could be anything. It could be cups of coffee or whatever. And I'm sort of a coffeeaholic. My first cup of coffee, I've got to get going pretty quickly in the morning, and I get lots and lots of benefit. It's one of the reasons why I get out of bed in the morning, is because I want to get my coffee going, right? And then maybe I'll have another cup, and maybe toward the end of the day, I can't see myself drinking ever more than maybe 3 or 4 cups during the day. I used to be a lot worse. I drink 10, 12 cups a day, and I am sure in the negative range of irritability and all that. So you get the idea. Utility can, in fact, become negative at some point. But one thing that's not in doubt is the fact that it's diminishing. Whatever the activity is, you get less and less incremental benefit from doing it as you consume 1 unit, however we measure that, of the next. Going to the gym, right? Your doctor says you're in terrible shape, go to the gym, start working out. So you spend an hour on the treadmill, you get lots and lots of benefit. But if you were to stay and do another hour, yeah, you'd still get benefit, but maybe less and less. And in fact, maybe it'd be very steep. Maybe after 6 hours on the treadmill, you maybe actually be in the negative range. You're not getting any benefit. You maybe are doing some damage. And so as a result, one thing that diminishing functions do tell us is the idea that we have a change going on, that it's not just a set piece where we get the same amount of utility every single time, every single time. And by the way, this area of consumer choice and consumer preference, sellers of goods, producers, let's say, of goods, know this very, very well and are always looking to keep the experience fresh, to keep things new, to keep things exciting, so that people, are interested in doing the same things. So even though we may buy the same detergent, Tide detergent, how many times has Procter & Gamble, which makes Tide, changed it up and said, we've got Tide with bleach in it, we've got Tide with fabric softener in it, Tide, Mountain Fresh Tide. I mean, it just goes on and on. You may still like the brand Tide because you are like a little robot, right? reaching for that, but now you might, hey, Mountain Fresh Tire, that sounds good, let's try that. Particularly if the price isn't prohibitive, then it's shrinking your consumption possibilities of other goods, right? It's keeping it new. And by the way, economists who study things like the entertainment business will always point to the fact that it just seems like in the entertainment field, you've got to amp up the new and different to the point where, think of movies. And if you look at old movies, how tame they used to be in terms of violence and every other, and language and all that. Today, pretty much anything goes. I mean, to the point where they're ultra violent. And I know I can relate a story when my mother was in her 20s and the movie Psycho came out. And there was a particular gruesome scene in a shower scene. If you've seen the movie, you know what I'm talking about. Anyway, without getting into it, it just completely freaked her out. And nobody had seen anything like that in a movie. This was like 1960 or whatever. Nobody had seen anything like that. And by the time we became sort of teenagers and we had the movie on, she was, oh, I can't believe you're watching this. This is awful. This is a terrible movie. And the scene came on, she had to leave the room. And my brother and I were just sort of saying, okay, well, this is not that unusual. We have seen that. So it's creating new experiences all the time, to the point where entertainment itself has to keep getting fresher and newer. And so I take my son, who's fairly small, to Cliff's or to Peter Piper's, and now the video games are extremely active. Lots of things going on, and people jumping out of helicopters and firing weapons and all that. It's very interactive. It's the idea of you got to keep moving up. You got to keep creating new utility, because people get tired of it. And think about the old forms of video entertainment, the old Pong game. I mean, my gosh, you could, you quickly lose utility on something like that. So you've got to have something new. And sellers understand this. And even with existing goods, they try to amp up the excitement by trying to raise the amount of utility, which, by the way, these utils do translate to dollar figures and price. And that is something we will cover again and again as we get into talking about market structure. So one thing about this, and this is kind of going to be a busy table here, and I don't know if you want to recreate it in your notes or not. You're free to, obviously, or free not to. You're free to do what you want. But I just want to sort of describe how this looks, particularly because if for no other reason, that marginals come up again and again in our discussion of economic variables, because we say that we've got three main kinds of values: totals, averages, and marginals. And so we want to talk about these differences here between these goods. And so again, if our consumption bundle consists only of pizza and concerts, right? And in this case, that is the only two goods. And we got a quantity consumed of pizzas, which run from 0 to 10. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Oh, I didn't leave myself very much room here. I guess you never know where you're going to end up until you get there. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I know this is kind of busy. Maybe I should have reproduced this on another board before we started this. And so we have total utility. Then we have marginal utility. Again, marginal utility is that incremental change in total utility divided by change in quantity. And remember, what a change in anything is new minus old, right? So it would be TU of 1 unit minus TU for 0 units divided by quantity at 1 unit minus quantity to 0. And you could go from 0 to 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, etc., all the way on up, or 5 to 6, or whatever. It's the same sort of methodology, right? Same goes with concerts, where we've got quantity of concerts, total utility, and we've got marginal utility. Only here we've got 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. And I'm just going to sort of fill in this table here. And then the key thing I want to get to is the marginal values. That's really the big thing. And I think that'll probably take us sort of to the end of the class. And then it'll only leave one final topic to cover, and that'll be the utility of actual dollars. That is marginal utility per dollar. That'll be the last thing we cover. And that puts us in good shape to go to the next topic, which also deals with marginals as well, but it'll be marginal cost in this case. So if we consume 0 units of anything, we get 0 utility, right? There's no question about that. But what if we consume 1 unit and we get 50 utils, right? Remember, total utility is measured in utils, whatever those utils are, right? and we know they exist, and it's just like any kind of hypothetical unit value. It's just like when I talked about that funny money little certificates that allowed us to park. Some people got 0 utils because they didn't park in the garage. They took the bus to work. They could care less, and they were always giving their tickets away because they knew that everyone got them, but they had utility to some, maybe not utility to others. It's just like cigarettes. If you smoke, you get utility. If you don't, you get 0. So here's the thing: if you do consume pizza and you get benefit, you get utility. Going from 0 to 50 means the incremental change is 50. Going from 0 to 50 is 50 units of marginal utility. It's old minus new. It's the change in total utility, TU1 minus TU0, 50 minus 0, over 1 minus 0, change in quantity, 1 minus 0. 1 minus 0 is 1, and anything divided by 1 is 50. But, and we set this at sort of this half step between it. We're earning this marginal incremental value as we go from 0 to 1, as we go from 1 to 2, etc. So if we get 2 units, then we end up with 90 units of utility in total, aggregate utility. That's 50 from the first unit, 40 from the second unit. So the change in the 2 is 40. And if we go from 50 to 90 to say 122, now we end up with 32 units of utility. From 1 to, as we go to 4 slices of pizza, now we end up at 150 total utils, and it's now 28 as we go between 122 and 150. From 150 or from 4 to 5, it's 176 units, and now the marginal utility is 26. I hope everyone can see what I'm doing. I'm simply taking the denominator is the same every time. It's 0 to 1, 1 to 2, 1 to, so it's the denominator is just 1 every time. So it's really the change in the numerator. But what if it's 10 to 20 or 10 to 35 or whatever, then it would make a difference. But the math is not all that complex. It's just simply the change in one thing divided by the change in another thing. So let's just finish this up here. Let's go 6 is 200, 222. And I just made these numbers up. These are not out of your book or anything. 250 to 275. And so what do we end up with here? We have, I can just do the math, 24, 22, 20, what is that, 17, and 16. Well, what can we say about this particular value? Marginal utility is doing what? It's going down, right? While the quantity goes up, the marginal utility goes down, which makes it a diminishing function. That is, we're getting incrementally less benefit. Because think about this. This is not all that difficult to understand why. Even when we talk about things like amping up the excitement or the utility of the benefit from something like movies and whatnot, it's because we've all seen the same things in movies before. We've got to have something new, or else why go to the movies, right? Nobody doubts that we like to go to the movies, but we like something new and different. Well, the same goes with pizza. How many pizzas are you going to want to buy before it's like, oh, yeah, pizza? Really? You're getting less and less and less benefit, to the point where if you get 30 pizzas, if you have that in your budget, would you probably get negative utility? It's like, pizza again, right? That sort of thing. And I know that there's, one of my colleagues was talking about utilities always being a reset, that maybe you stop buying pizza for a while, and you revisit in 6 months, and you've jumped back up again, right? Because you're back to your first unit again, and it's new again, it's exciting, it's something different, right? And so as a result, your utility jumps up. And that's the whole business of variety. And by the way, this is one of the things that probably those people who expound on the benefits of free markets probably don't sell enough to the rest of the world. And that's the idea that one thing about free markets is that it does create new products and new interest and new value all the time. We saw in the command economies of the old Soviet Union, the People's Republic of China, where you might if you get a new car, it's going to be this color of car. It's going to be this number of doors. It's going to look like this. And you might get a lot of benefit from it because it's the only one you're going to get, but it's not going to be necessarily exciting. You can't swap it out for another one because you're not going to get another one, right? And if you go to the store, you're not going to have a lot of choice. So consumer choice theory is constrained in these economies that decide that governments know better than private actors how to produce and distribute output. Private actors do a pretty good job. Are they perfect? No. And we're going to certainly spend our time talking about imperfections in these particular markets. But for all goods, in all utility functions, the idea is that we're going to have a diminishing function. So if we took this to and let's just sort of fill in the blanks here. And so at 0 constants, we get 0 total utility, therefore 0 marginal utility, obviously. But we don't need to, but we're interested in between 0 and 1, 1 and 2. If we consume one constant, we get 75 units, and so between 0 and 1 is 75. And 123 total utility between 1 and 2, which goes to 48. And simply, we'll just simply fill in the values 159, 183, 205. And again, we have a diminishing function as we keep going here, 36, 24, 22. In other words, these values are going down because enough for the constants already, right? That sort of thing. So you get the idea that if you are consuming more of one thing and less of something else, that you are really diminishing the amount of total utility that you're getting over time on the margin, what we call on the margin. And economists love using the term on the margin. It means at some incremental level, as we go from one incremental level to the next, we get less and less incremental benefit. So this is why having more income is better than having less income. As if anybody needed any convincing on that subject, it allows you to expand your consumption possibilities so that you can not only choose pizza and concerts, but also things like movies and baseball games and foreign travel and clothing and whatever. I mean, the list of goods can go on and on and on and on. And we'll get to that when we talk more about consumption bundles and what that's all about. One final thing I'll talk about here with regard to that is that has to do with consumption possibilities. And that is, it's sort of analogous to this idea of steep versus flat demand curves. And that is if we have a very steep marginal utility curve, then it must be that utility falls off very, very, very quickly. So some goods where it's a very steep marginal utility curve, it means that as you go from 1 to 2 units, okay, you're getting less and less incremental benefit. Okay, I'm done, right? That sort of thing. And so it's more of a one-shot sort of deal. Whereas in other cases where the marginal utility curve is relatively flat, there's a less and less incremental drop-off. By the way, it also has to do with the budget line and consumption possibilities in general. And think about this. If, I don't know if any of you have children or have younger siblings or whatever, you might notice that they might watch the same movie again and again and again and again and again, to the point where it's like, oh my God, you're going berserk, you're watching the same movie. Well, so they have a very flat marginal utility curve, meaning that they have a fairly limited consumption bundle. They don't have lots of possibilities beyond watching movies. What are they going to do? They can't leave the house. They can't do a lot of things. So it's an explanation for why somebody would choose to do more of it. It's because they get less and less incremental benefit, but relative to other things, there aren't other possibilities out there available to consume. And so as a result, they'll do that same sort of behavior over and over again. Whereas people who've got lots of choices do one thing, they're done with it very quickly and move on to try other sorts of things. Okay. All right. So that sort of does it for that. The only bit I've got to cover on this, which I'll get to on Monday, deals with marginal utility per dollar. That is how we allocate our dollars, not just between the two goods, but to the point where we're getting the most benefit per dollar. That is, yes, we've talked about the fact that pizzas cost $10 and concerts cost $20. But what's the right mix between those, given our budget? I mean, we said that we had an IVA race of A, B, C, D, E, and F. But what is the right combination? If 0 of one and 5 of the other and 0 of one or 10 of the other is maybe inadequate because as you consume more of that one good, you're getting less and less benefit from it and 0 benefit from the other good, then maybe is there some sweet spot in the middle where you're getting the most benefit for the most dollar. It's called the most bang for the buck, right? We've heard that term over and over again. That is the way that we will measure that, and we will get to that on Monday. So unless you have any questions, I think that will do it for today. Everybody have a great weekend. So I'll see you next time.